I came to the Pacific Coast at the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area. Congress created the ODNRA in 1972 to protect the unique environment, read humongous piles of sand, that covered 40 miles of coast from the Coos to the Siuslaw rivers. While dunes were common enough along both coasts, what made these special was their sheer size. Some of the larger sand piles were over 180 feet tall and pushed inland as far as Route 101. They were created over millions of years by water and wind grinding down the coastal mountain ranges, rivers carrying the sand to the ocean, currents pushing it ashore, and wind carrying it into the dunes. Besides the seemingly endless fields of fine sand, random pockets of tree islands, bits of forest growing near the coast completely surrounded by dunes, spotted the ODNRA. The islands, some as small as a handful of young shrubs and others the size of football fields with fully mature trees, looked like desert oases, their vibrant greens growing out of the pale and fertile sand. Riding along Route 101 with sand blowing across the road like snowdrifts, I was anxious to get to the ocean. The wind-blown sand felt greasy beneath my tires, making leaning into turns feel like a game of Russian roulette. Eventually, I found signs directing me toward an entry point for the beach, and I followed them to a parking lot where half the asphalt was covered in tailings from the dunes, and the other half was covered in pickup trucks towing utility trailers. While Congress had created the ODNRA in order to protect the unique natural phenomenon, in reality it was used as an all-terrain vehicle playground. No one was coming to the dunes to sit and watch the water when they could carve through endless acres of sand at suicidal speeds. I'd assumed that the signs I'd followed would lead me to a beach parking lot like the places I'd been to in Maine and New Hampshire, where you could park near the ocean and have a brief, somewhat downhill walk to the water. What I hadn't expected was a 3-story wall of loose sand standing between me and that leisurely downhill stroll. Carrying only a beach towel and a six-pack, the hike over this mound would have been a challenge. Fully clothed with thick canvas pants, hiking boots, and lugging a 50-pound pack made it almost impossible. I'd grown up hiking in the Northeast Appalachians, where the unofficial motto was "switchbacks are for pussies." I'd scrambled over rock screes, shimmied between boulders, and crossed mountain-fed rivers so cold I felt like Ted Williams' head by the time I made it to the far bank. And I could honestly say that none of those hikes kicked my ass as much as this 30-foot pile of loose sand. Admittedly, 3 years of desk work wasn't helping. Red-faced and sweating, I huffed my way up the side of the dune. Every shortened step I took, I'd sink up to my ankles, my shoes filling with loose grains, and slide half the distance back down. My pack tugged at my shoulders, trying to pull me over backwards unless I leaned forward, where it threatened to plant me face first into the side of the dune. Halfway up, I decided that if I fell, I wasn't getting back up. I was going to barrel roll my way back to my bike and sleep wherever I stopped tumbling. After 3 breaks on the way up, and that's not counting the one I took at the crest of the hill where I pretended to be enjoying the view, but was really trying my hardest not to drop to my knees, I made it down to the water's edge. Kneeling in the packed wet sand, I dipped my hand up to the wrist in the ocean, still trying to catch my breath with nothing but salt water stretching as far as I could see, feeling the tiny grains of sand beneath my feet that'd taken millions of years to build up on this very spot. I couldn't help but think, I don't even like the ocean. I knew people who had borderline religious experiences every time they walked barefoot on a beach. Maybe it was the enormity of the water making them feel infinitesimally small, or maybe it was the leftover DNA from that curious fish billions of years in our genetic past that crawled up onto land in search for a better tan. But that was never the case for me. Where other people saw a vast reservoir from which all life on Earth once crawled, I saw a giant cauldron of undrinkable water filled with man-eating sharks, krakens, and Colombian narco subs. Feeling foolish for killing myself just to experience something I couldn't care less about, an argument broke out in my head. Why did you trudge up a sand dune from hell just to wet your knuckles? I wanted to touch the ocean. You weren't sure it was wet? I'd never been to the Pacific before. I should at least touch it before heading back east. Let me guess, it felt a lot like the Atlantic or a lake or what comes out of a faucet. I was doing the same thing that people riding bikes across the country do when they dip a wheel in the ocean at the beginning and end of their trip. So you're imitating men who wear spandex shorts and shave their legs? Mom would be so proud. It was symbolic. Yeah, well, the heart attack you're going to have hiking back up that hill isn't going to be symbolic. I'm 28 years old. I'm not going to have a heart attack. Okay, stroke, aneurysm, whatever. I wasn't about to ride all the way to the Pacific and not touch the water. If I turned around at that dune, what would I do when people back home asked me if I'd touched the ocean? You're spending a month on a motorcycle riding through some of the roughest climates and challenging roads in the country. When you get home, if the only thing people ask is, "Did you touch the ocean?" you get to slap them. It's not like I have anywhere else to be. And I didn't. For the foreseeable future, I had nowhere in particular to be and no time to be there. I gave the water one last look, turned, and lowering my head until all I could see was a few feet of sand in front of me, trudged back up the hill. Back in the parking lot, I hit the bathroom. It was set up just like the restrooms in the campgrounds, a little rectangular box with a toilet bolted directly over a cesspit. There were hunks of wadded, possibly secondhand toilet paper stuck in the corners of the room, and the concrete was wet. Since the bathroom had no running water, there were limited possibilities of what kind of liquid made up the glistening puddles. Across the inside of the toilet lid, some aspiring political propagandist had spray painted "Where your," spelled YOU''RE, freedom has gone, with a red arrow pointing into the shit. No doubt this Guy Fawkes wannabe had a promising future career dancing papier-mâché puppets in front of G8 summits, but his graffiti warning might have had more resonance had the sprayer possessed the grammatical skills of a semi-literate 8th grader. If 7 years in college had taught me one thing, it was the difference between your and your. Admittedly, most people had figured that out by 5th or 6th grade without going tens of thousands of dollars in debt. At the moment, I had more urgent problems than the failure of the American educational system. Namely, I needed to use that bathroom. While this normally wouldn't be a big deal, I'd been using bathrooms with relative success since I graduated from Underoos. Even the simplest task became awkwardly complicated when you were living out of a backpack. Before I could take care of nature, I had to figure out what to do with my pack. I couldn't wear it, and there were no hooks to hang it from. Even if there had been, its weight might have simply torn them from the wall. The logical thing to do would have been to leave the pack outside, but I wasn't a trusting enough human being for that. Even when I stopped at gas stations to get a drink, the pack stayed with me, risking the destruction of countless shelves of priceless convenience store shot glasses and snow globes every time I tried to buy a Coke. I was terrified that as soon as I let it out of my sight, some asshole would walk off with it, leaving me homeless with no clothes or food. Plus, I'd borrowed most of my gear from my oldest brother, and the last time we checked, he could still kick my ass. The logical thing to do was to leave it sitting on the public outhouse's floor, but I'd almost rather it got stolen. I wasn't a germaphobe. My pockets weren't stuffed with travel-sized containers of Purell, and I rarely walked around my house wearing slippers made out of Kleenex boxes, but my skin crawled at the thought of anything more than the soles of my shoes touching that floor. Eventually, I solved the bathroom problem, not to go into too much detail, but involved a stressful Cirque du Soleil balancing act, and returned to my bike. Out of curiosity, I checked the odometer, almost 900 miles since leaving Boise. My original estimate for the entire trip, which I'd come to by the highly scientific method of cocking my head to one side and squinting at a map of North America, was only 4,000 miles. It looked like I might break 1,000 before I made it out of Oregon, and I had 17 more states to go. Out of the 7 major attractions I'd planned on visiting, I'd only made it to Hell's Canyon in the Pacific Coast. I still had to see the Grand Canyon, Arches National Park, Rocky Mountains, Blue Ridge Parkway, and Skyline Drive. My negative side immediately took over. Where are you going to find an oil change? How much longer will the tires hold out? The last set only lasted 10,000 miles and you're already up over 4,000 on this set. How are you going to afford an extra 3,000 miles worth of gas? What about food? How many more days is it going to take? Hurricane season's coming back east. What are you going to do if you get trapped by a storm in the Carolinas? Why didn't you plan this out better? Maybe you should have gone back to swinging a hammer. Why did you think a master's degree in make-believe was a good idea? All the questions tumbled into one another, creating a swell of white noise until all I could do was stare at my bike while that little voice second-guessed every decision I'd made since learning to walk. Doubts and questions came faster and faster, one on top of the other, a wall of thoughts coming to a crescendo, and then nothing. As quickly as it started, it went silent. It wasn't that I had any answers. I had something better than answers. I had Dunning-Kruger. Also, I had the knowledge that there wasn't a damn thing I could do about any of it. I couldn't fix anything. I was already waist deep in whatever shit show this was going to be, and my only real option was to keep going and deal with things as they came up. Worrying about what might happen wasn't going to do anything but give me ulcers. Realizing I was powerless to change anything was strangely freeing in a way that I didn't fully understand. I wanted to call it a Zen moment, but that was only because I knew nothing about Eastern religions. With a newfound peace, I put on my helmet and headed south down the Pacific Coast Highway. The Pacific Coast Highway was one of those roads that, from the first time I learned it existed, I knew I wanted to ride it. For a biker, there were certain roads that just seemed to naturally call to you, whether it was the Blue Ridge Parkway, Route 66, or the Bolivian Road of Death. They all had their own siren songs. For me, the Pacific Coast Highway called the loudest. Made up of parts of 3 roads, Highway 101, Highway 1, and the Route 5 freeway, the Pacific Coast Highway consisted of 1,550 miles cutting along the ocean in 3 states. Beginning in the early 1900s, it took 25 years to build, starting with basic machines, convict labor, and animal power. Steam shovels, bulldozers, and explosives replaced people and animals in the mid-1920s. Some sections were so remote and treacherous that surveyors had to work from boats and by rappelling over cliffs. In places, the terrain made construction almost impossible, and work crews were constantly battered by rough weather and winds strong enough to knock over bridge staging. When finally finished, the Pacific Coast Highway would be one of the most expensive roads to maintain and repair due to constant erosion, rock slides, and corrosive saltwater. But it would also be world famous for its views and draw visitors for the sole purpose of driving the route. The view riding south on 101 was iconic, dangerously beautiful. In spots directly to the right of the pavement, the road fell away to beach and rocky coast. If I wanted to keep my organs inside my body, then I needed to pay attention to the road ahead of me, but it was impossible to concentrate on the road when the landscape kept pulling my eyes towards it. Black cliffs dropping away to rolling waves, a sandy beach with a single monolithic boulder reaching 100 feet above the water, with a lone foot trail pushing up its spine, weathered and salted driftwood half buried in sand. The beaches I'd grown up visiting in Maine and New Hampshire were almost always bordered by miles of salt marsh. You could smell the salt and decay, especially at low tide, miles before you were anywhere near the ocean. Trees, unless they were planted, didn't grow anywhere near the beach, and the only vegetation near the water was dune grass and scrub brush, often speckled with empty beer cans and used condoms. Compared to those eastern beaches, the western shoreline appeared rugged and clean. Black, craggy rocks jutted out into the surf, and rock islands rose from the water. In places, the forest ran right up to the edge of the ocean with little more than a sliver of sand separating the two. The contrast of the green trees, black rocks, and blue water, with colors so deep that I'd have sworn they could have only existed in paint cans, made for stunningly beautiful landscapes. More than once I got caught up staring and dropped my front tire into a pothole deep enough to almost throw me from my bike. I stopped in gravel pullouts to take pictures that didn't do justice to what I saw. It seemed like I couldn't get more than a quarter of a mile without something demanding I pull over and snap a half dozen photos. Late in the day, I came across an especially beautiful section of coast where the highway curled along cliffs and a high hill pushed out into the water before dropping off suddenly to the waves. Below it, the beach made a slow, natural turn, with the dark, wet sand and light, dry sand looking like stripes in the world's palest rainbow. If I could frame the shot right, I'd catch the waves, the beach, the cliff, and the winding road all in a single picture. I pulled my bike to a stop in the crushed gravel pull-off along the road, took my camera out of its pouch, and climbed a 3-foot dirt berm that was meant to keep wayward cars from crashing down a 15-foot drop to a patch of saplings and blackberry bushes below. All my attention was focused on the little 3-inch LCD screen as I worked the zoom in an attempt to get the perfect picture. I barely noticed the brush directly below me rustle. I was completely absorbed as I zoomed in and out, changing the ratio of cliff, wave, and beach. Below me, branches snapped. Finally, I looked down from my camera to the head of a coastal black bear gorging itself on berries. If I dropped my camera, it would have bounced off its ass. My saliva evaporated, and my stomach scrambled past all my other organs to lodge itself quivering in the back of my throat. Oh, shit. The bear looked up at the sound of my voice, saw me standing above, and lunged back into the cover of the brambles, which was fortunate because I was frozen. It could have sauntered up the embankment and eaten my head, and I might not have even moved. People will probably point out that bear attacks are rare, the animals being more skittish than dangerous, and not something that I should have worried about. Valid points all. But, mathematically speaking, for every 1,000 skittish bears, there had to be at least one asshole. And if bears were anything like humans, oceanfront living exponentially increased the chances of it being an asshole. The next morning, I crossed into Northern California and into Redwood country, which was a good place to see really tall trees and really dirty hippies. The Pacific Coast Highway ran through national and state parks dedicated to preserving the world's tallest trees and the ecosystem that they were a major part of. I'd grown up hearing about the amazing redwoods all my life. Everyone talked about how the redwoods were enormous, many with trunks wider than my motorcycle was long, but what people didn't say was that they were so big that they were almost beyond comprehension. A mature tree's trunk, which was often all you could see, was encased in a solid foot of fire-retardant bark. Standing among the roots and looking skyward, they seemed to go on forever, and I half expected the top to lead to a giant with a golden egg-laying goose. As the road wound its way through the misty forest, pull-offs, trails, and information stations gave tourists safe places to enter the woods without fear of getting lost. I stopped and walked among the trees on the manicured paths. Reading pamphlets and plaques as I walked, I learned that the trees could reach up to almost 380 feet and only stopped growing when they couldn't suck water from their roots to their top branches. That it took roughly 125,000 redwood seeds to weigh a pound, and that hippies who'd come to these giants to commune with the spirit of the earth didn't think it was funny when you clicked your tongue and said, "So how many board feet of lumber do you suppose one of these babies has?" Leaving the redwoods behind before the hippies forgot their pacifist beliefs, I rode to Eureka to have my oil changed and eat lunch. Once I'd taken care of those necessities, I stopped at a gas station to fuel up, without the help of a trained professional, I might add. I'd just finished topping off my tank and I pulled out a road map of California I'd bought the day before. The origami folded map gave better detail than the Rand McNally in my pack, and it called out scenic roads with green dots. I already knew where I was heading, but wanted to double-check my route. I'd barely gotten the thing unfolded when a guy fueling up a pickup truck at the next pump called over to me. One of the tricks I'd picked up on this trip was, if I wanted to strike up a conversation, which was rare, all I had to do was pull out my map and pretend to be searching for something. As soon as people saw me with a map, they'd immediately tell me what was around, what I should see, and what I should skip. It worked in diners and gas stations all across the country. Unfortunately, it had the same effect when I didn't really want to talk to anyone, but still needed to check my route. People that offered advice fell into two distinct categories. They either had an honest desire to be helpful, or they had a need to feel smarter than somebody else. "What are you looking for?" the truck driver asked. He'd only said 4 words, and I could already tell which category he fell into. Admittedly, I was in a bit of a mood already. Another night of oatmeal and an asphalt mattress had all but silenced my positive side. "I'm headed to the Grand Canyon," I said. "What road you gonna take?" He leaned over the bed of his truck, resting his forearms across the rail. 299, I said. It was north of the city, squiggling its way east over the Shasta Trinity National Forest. The little green dots combined with all the twists promised a fun motorcycle road. I'd looked forward to that little piece of asphalt since first seeing it. "No, you're not," he said, with a tone that I might use to say, "You can't drink lead paint." I looked from him to the map and back to him, trying to think of a polite way to tell this complete stranger that I could go wherever the hell I wanted. Unfortunately, all the versions I could think of used the word fuck prodigiously, so I bit my tongue. He shook his head. 299 is a terrible road. Let me see that map. He spoke with the volume and certainty of drunks and politicians. I tamped down my negative side and walked over to his half-ton truck. A wheelbarrow, stepladder, and pair of toolboxes took up most of the room in the bed. Letters from some college I'd never heard of were emblazoned across his sweatshirt. Up close, I could see that he had the body of someone who had been in shape in high school 15 or 20 years ago, and too much Bud Light and Hot Wings had taken their toll. "I was on 299 last week and almost caught air a bunch of times," he said. Apparently slowing down and paying attention to the road hadn't occurred to him. "I was towing my trailer, almost lost the damn thing twice." He took the map out of my hands and creased it against the side of his truck. "I'm not too attached to any particular route," I said, trying to give the guy the benefit of the doubt that he might know a better way. "I just need to get east and avoid cities and highways." "Well, you're a dumbass if you take Route 299, he said, scanning the coastline of California. "Now where are we?" His finger traced along the ocean while his face scrunched up in annoyance as he tried to find Eureka. Other side," I said. You want Northern California?" "These damn things," he said, creasing the map again as he flipped it over. "I swear they make them so you have to have a PhD in physics to figure them out. Okay, here we go." He found the city we were in on the map, which was a step in the right direction. "I appreciate the help," I lied. "Not a problem. You looked lost and I thought I better give you a hand." I thought that was odd since I was just double-checking my route and he'd needed help figuring out which side of the map we were on, but again, I didn't say anything. "Yeah, I ride the mountains sometimes, he said, nodding toward my bike. I'm more of a ninja guy, though. I like my bike small and sporty, not big and lumbering. In a 2-minute conversation, my new gas station buddy had managed to call me stupid, lost, and insult my motorcycle. He was doughy, loud, and even though he was doing me a favor, I had a palpable urge to smack him. So the fact he rode sports bikes wasn't surprising. For the uninitiated, there were basically two types of road motorcycles, sport bikes and cruisers. Cruisers were bigger, heavier, with visible metal gas tanks and were more comfortable to ride. Sport bikes were lighter with plastic body coverings, higher power-to-weight ratios, engines that sounded like angry weed whackers, and seats engineered specifically to show off the top half of the passenger girlfriend's leopard print thong. If you're in the market for a motorcycle and can't decide what type to buy, you should ask yourself one question. Am I a douchebag? For some reason, 99.5% of sport bike riders were douchebags. That is a verifiable scientific fact that I just made up. Something about these bikes attracted the kind of person who wanted to wear white tank tops, gold chains, and pop wheelies down crowded highways, often with their butterfly tramp-stamped girlfriend clinging to their backs. If you already own a sport bike and are thinking, hey, I'm not a douchebag, I'll say the same thing I always say to all sport bike riders. I'm sure you're the exception. Ignoring my baser urges, I said, I'm just trying to avoid highways and cities as much as possible. You really don't want to take 299, he continued. I've been riding for years, and there are parts of that road that even scare me. I'm not saying you're a bad rider, I'm just saying... He trailed off with a look on his face that said, you can't possibly be as good as me. He ran his finger back and forth across the map. This is what you want to do. The only way his route could have been worse was if he'd drawn it over the ocean. His finger traced too many blue lines, crowded 4-lane straight high-speed highways, and put me right through the center of more cities than I'd ride through in the entire rest of my trip. It was exactly the kind of ride I'd told him I was avoiding. I was about to ask if there was any other options when I noticed a thin red line that met up with the Pacific Coast Highway just south of Eureka and cut across the Shasta Trinity National Forest to the town of Red Bluff. I considered asking him about the road, but decided it'd be less of a headache if I just let him keep thinking I was going to follow his advice and then did whatever the hell I wanted anyway. Route 36, the road I'd picked to replace Route 299, had been called the best motorcycle road in all of California by some. Others called it humbling. Leaving the Pacific Coast Highway behind for Route 36, a series of signs warned truckers away from the steep grades and sharp turns. To a biker, those signs were invitations. They were meant as warnings, but what they really said was, come test your chicken strips. The ride started out tame, a few hills, a few curves, but nothing even remotely challenging. I started getting cocky. I thought, what a waste to put truck warning signs on a road that drowsy octogenarians could handle. Maybe California really is such a nanny state that all their back roads have these kinds of warnings. Careful, there's a curve, use your headlights, brush your teeth. But then I got cockier thinking, I've got over 14,000 miles of riding under my belt. It's possible that Route 36 actually is hard, but I'm so good a rider that I don't even recognize difficult roads anymore. I was downright arrogant and wanted to get California behind me so I could move on to roads that were more my caliber. It was the kind of hubris that historically came right before your wax wings melted and you face-planted into the ocean. Suddenly, the wide lanes that eased around hills narrowed into a thin strip of pavement snaking its way up a mountain, with fatal drop-off on one side of the road and a mountain rising on the other. My whole Zen not worrying thing went out the window. Stray rocks the size of hand grenades washed onto the pavement, waiting to catch a wayward tire. Logging trucks loaded down with lumber tore around corners with the confidence of the devout, straying into the oncoming lane with pure faith that no vehicle would be there. At every blind turn, I expected to catch a truck's bumper across the chest and be hurled, bike and all, off the side of the mountain. And there were a lot of blind turns. In fact, there were a lot of every kind of turn. Blind, sharp, suicidal. There were so many twists, cuts, turns, and curves that the route had a special sign. In a lot of ways, it was similar to a common sign on many American back roads, a simple yellow square set on its point with a black arrow in its center squirming its way through a set of tight curves. But what made this one stand out among the thousands like it was the small rectangle beneath that read, "Next 140 miles." It wasn't often that you came across a sign warning of curves that would last longer than most of my adult relationships. Toward the top of one mountain, I came across a section of road that had been washed out, with an entire lane's worth of gravel and chunks of pavement strewn over 100 yards down the steep mountainside. With half the road gone, wooden barricades sat along the edge of the washout, blocking cars from the gaping hole. Next to them, a blinking yellow light sat perched on a construction sign that simply read, "Take turns." So much for the nanny state. Then there were the curve ahead signs that looked more like geometry problems than road conditions. Black arrows made cuts and twists bending 90 degrees or more on a 55-mile-an-hour road as if that were a normal thing to do. There were signs that, when I came to them, my first thought wasn't, "I should slow down," it was, "A road can't do that." But this road could. For whole stretches in the mountains, the state stopped bothering to warn of approaching twists altogether, whether to save money or because the turns couldn't accurately be depicted in 2 dimensions, I didn't know. One particular set was so sharp and steep, switchbacking its way uphill, that for the first and only time in my life, I considered getting off and pushing my 600-pound bike up a mountain. Route 36 was the first road I'd ever been on that I was actually afraid of. I was always nervous riding, but this was spider-infested, dentist-clown-themed roller coaster scared. I rode for hours with death grips on the handlebars, my entire body tensed and my eyes constantly scanning for debris, washouts, and deer. When it finally straightened out near Red Bluff, I'd never been so happy to see a gas station in my entire life. I hadn't realized it until I stepped off my bike, but the 140 miles of curves had drained me. From the outside, riding a motorcycle looked as easy as sitting, but in reality, I was being buffeted by wind, grit, and bugs. The air passing over me wicked liquids, dehydrating me until my lips were white and chapped like I'd been wandering the desert. After tensing my entire body for hours, I was as physically drained as if I'd just run a marathon. I say this having never actually run a marathon because 26.2 miles was a long way and cars exist. My pack suddenly felt as if it was filled with concrete, and the straps cut into my shoulders like hot wire. My forearms ached from squeezing the handlebars. My ass felt like it burrowed a hole straight through the seat and now rode on the bare metal frame. I needed a bed, a real one, with blankets, a mattress, and everything. At the start of the trip, my plan had been to camp out as much as possible, only getting a room when I needed to charge my phone or camera. But I was too tired to push any further, and Red Bluff had beds for rent. I rolled down the main street looking for motels. With my bank account, the national chains weren't a possibility. Even the ones with budget and quality in their names were beyond my wallet. That put my options squarely in the Norman Bates scale of hospitality. Passing by a couple national chains' neon signs, I pulled into the parking lot of a local place with a sign claiming they had the lowest prices in town. After seeing the inside, I didn't doubt it. The building was set up in the customary one-story horseshoe, with the office on one point and the rooms running side by side forming a U. A little old lady who lived in a manager's apartment attached to the office ran the place. She took one look at me and begrudgingly rented me a room as far away from her as possible. Not that I blamed her. The skin around my eyes was sunken and dark enough to be confused for the results of blunt trauma. I hadn't seen the inside of a shower in the better part of a week, and my hair was matted and greasy from too many hours inside my helmet. My beard, patchy and grown out, was firmly in the stage favored by the criminally insane. After 1,300 miles as a human flyswatter, wings, eyes, legs, stingers, and all matter of intestines from squashed bugs were glued to my coat and t-shirt. I was so covered in iridescent insect bits that I looked like I'd been covered in glitter. "Is there a place around here where I could find something to eat?" I asked, trying to wipe some of the bug guts off my chest. Without saying a word, she reached down behind the counter, pulled out a Domino's pizza flyer, and with one finger slid it across the counter. Before I could even reach for it, she turned and disappeared behind her door, which emitted a series of clicks, thunks, and deadbolt sliding home noises. At first, I didn't blame her for reacting like that, not when I was fully unwashed serial killer chic, but then I saw my room, and I thought I was the one who should have been sliding home deadbolts. It had the funk of a grandmother's attic, smelling like no one had so much as opened a window since they'd hung the snazzy wood paneling on the walls. It was the kind of place where you were afraid to step into the shower barefoot, and even the soap might carry diseases. A bottle opener was bolted inside the bathroom door frame, and I killed 3 spiders in the first 5 minutes. It would have been 4, but one, horror movie quick, got away. The last occupant had stuffed the peephole with a wad of toilet paper, which meant one of 2 things. Either he didn't want anyone seeing into the room because he was a high-ranking politician who had brought his secretary here for an affair, or he didn't want anyone to see the duffel bag of meth and assault rifles he had laid out on the bed. The dried husks of dead beetles on the bathroom towels told me this wasn't the kind of place future presidents brought interns. Before I did anything else, I bolted the door shut and propped a chair behind it. Calling home to let my mother know I was done for the day, I made sure she knew the name of the motel in case I went missing in the night. Content that my parents had a good starting point should I suddenly disappear, I double-checked all the locks and crawled into bed. My last thought before I fell asleep was, I hope they at least find my body.